Well, at this point, we need to address response and mitigation in the context of desertification. And I imagine you noted in the last presentation that there really are different combinations of human driving forces in different places, especially when it comes to desertification. And so the response has been really significant, and we're going to talk about the United Nations, in the sense that it's really the only and the first response that identifies different regions based on different desertification challenges, as well as non-proximate driving forces in a way that structures response involving international partnerships in a way that's never been done before. So we're going to talk a little bit about the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification. This was an agreement that was finalized in 1994 and went into effect in 1996, which kind of laid out the framework for how global response, should be undertaken with regards to deforestation. Now, it has been revised since, and we're going to talk about two of those kind of revisions. But I want to point out that in Canvas, there are two key documents that have to do with desertification. The first one is called Down to Earth, and it essentially is the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, and it's a nice summary. And it essentially has pages, one page each is dedicated to the different strategies. So it's a nice summary to review. The other is a 2-page kind of list of the major headings, if you like, that are in the convention. So I would recommend that you have a look at the Down to Earth article. Now, just as a note, it opens as a PDF, but it's kind of glitchy in Canvas. So if you just download it, just to be able to read through it, I think that would be very helpful. And then the other document, which is a 2-page list, that's probably worth printing out just because it would be good to use for your final take-home exam. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the UN Convention in terms of its main features, what makes it different, what makes it unique, and how we're moving through reframing the agreement in a very positive way. So let's start. Now, one of the first things that the United Nations does is recognize that, as I mentioned, there are 4 distinct regions that have, within each, share similarities in terms of the nature of the non-proximates as well as the impacts, which are different from other regions. And so they have created what are called action plans for 4 different regions. One is Africa, one is Asia, one is Latin America and the Caribbean, and one is the North Mediterranean. And so what's interesting is we haven't called on specific countries. We're not calling on specific political organizations to address certain targets. We're identifying common regions that share certain elements, with the idea that they can help each other within each region combat their own specific issues. Now, another key thing as an intro is it very much focuses on long-term strategies in terms of decades strategies. And if you remember when we talked about ozone depletion, which was the Montreal Protocol, that was kind of like, we got to get this done now. That is within 10 to 15 years. It was very short-term, almost an emergency reaction, and it was needed, of course. With the Kyoto Protocol and all of the events since for global climate change, that's been kind of a drag on. We're trying to make an agreement for 10 years out, but then we can't make an agreement, so let's shoot it out another 10 years. Whereas the UN Convention was built in a way that encouraged long-term strategies and encouraged flexibility in updating those strategies when needed. Now, let's talk about some of the really key components of this. And this is where reading the Down to Earth, I think, would be very helpful, because they give more detail, but it's not in a official policy lingo. It's in a very much explanatory context in that Down to Earth article. So one of the key ideas is we need to rethink how we develop plans for addressing a problem like desertification. In the past, it's generally been top-down, meaning somehow we had global experts who were going to use their wisdom to come along with these perfect responses needed in different places. Well, the reality is, quite often, those individuals or those organizations have no idea what's going on the ground. And the reality is, without understanding the nature of all of the non-proximates in a given location, you can't really put together a plan to address problems. So in this convention, the significant component is, the key is a bottom-up approach, meaning getting the participation of local individuals, communities, are key to the success of this. And of course, this is called participatory development. It's coming up with a plan that involves the participation of all people who will be impacted. And the logic is, if you are part of the process, even if the outcome isn't exactly what you would have wanted, or the process isn't exactly what you would have wanted, you're accepting of it because you were involved in the process of moving forward. And this is very typical in, urban development, where, if you're planning a new development in a community, you bring everyone together, they participate, they might vote on different projects. And the idea is, regardless of the outcome, because people were allowed to have a say, they're more likely to be accepting of the result, even if it's not what they personally wanted. Now, in the context of desertification, the idea here is ideas that are kind of owned by the people who are going to be bringing them to fruition is more likely to create change than if the experts, I'm doing air quotes, come in and tell them what they're supposed to do without having a clue what reality is like on the ground. And of course, this is where the long-term strategies come in, because quite often the non-proximates are inherent in the ideology of the place, the culture of the place, the political system of the place, and the community is more likely to be able to identify some of those and how they're interconnected much more efficiently than an outsider might. Now, another important component is the fact that governments are expected to create what's called an enabling environment. Now, this really is with regards to policy. This may come down to strengthening existing laws. It may come down to enacting new laws. So let's think about the things that kind of threaten the way that people use the land, or might affect the way they make decisions about the land. There we go. So, for example, in many less developed countries, people don't have land ownership rights and land ownership protection, or land tenure. And as a result, they feel like they don't have a lot of say in how they use the land. And if, I'm sure we've talked about this before, but when a person or a community feels ownership of land, they are more likely to look after it in the long run. I think I made the example of protecting elephant herds in sub-Saharan Africa, is that the local community, desperate for money, they were actually enabling poachers. They were the guides and the hunters. But as soon as their governments gave communities ownership of the herd in terms of making sure that they're safe, those communities could, develop ecosystem. They could deliver ecotourism. They could establish a whole different kind of employment base, which was more sustainable if they were granted ownership. So the idea here is perhaps government needs to introduce land tenure reforms to give locals a greater feeling of ownership and responsibility, which usually results in more efficient and effective use of land, and usually results in higher productivity, which is good for everybody. It might also include, energy policies. When you think about one of the main reasons that desertification can happen is through deforestation. Well, maybe the government needs to pass an energy policy that would encourage sustainable woodland management for fuel wood, might introduce alternate energy sources, might provide some kinds of economic reforms to actually promote kind of long-term investment as opposed to short-term investment by not just landowners but individuals. All of those kinds of policies are examples of an enabling environment which needs to be created by governments, both state governments and local governments, to allow some of the changes to take place. So, as I mentioned, energy policies. Those would be an example of enabling environments. Now, another really key component of this agreement was that it really reshapes international aid. Traditionally, international aid comes in the form of, donating money to a general cause, which then gets, like the Red Cross or a specific non-governmental organization, which then is supposed to flow to where it's needed most. Well, the idea here isn't so much it's international aid, but it's international partnerships. They want to engage the donor nations, countries, agencies, and recipient countries in a kind of partnership. In the past, we've learned a lot about how we could improve development aid. In the past, many aid efforts weren't effective because they were supply driven. They're driven by the financing agency, what they think the people need. They're handled by top-down planners. They're delivered without any kind of coordination at the regional or the local levels. Now the goal is to develop programs that are coordinated, where we'll call them donor or aid countries are paired up with the recipient countries in formal ways to ensure that whatever efforts are being made, whether it's money being donated or technology being developed and or provided, the partnerships between places assures that the needs are appropriately being met. So the goal with international aid in this context is to be need-driven, not supply-driven. And that's where community participation is a really big part of this. Now, another feature has to do with science and technology. And it recognizes that we need science and technology because they're vital tools that we need to fight desertification. So when you think about science, we need more research into the linkages between, desertification, the human non-proximates, as well as, of course, soil systems, water systems, and people. And so we need key research in areas that involve not just, climatology, but hydrology, zoology, ecology, social sciences. These are all need to be better researched and understood based on location. Technology. Wow, the satellite imagery we can use now, the high-tech communication systems we can use to identify places which are lacking in, soil moisture or different kinds of nutrients. We can most accurately identify where different things are missing, so we can target specific locations for different treatments. Excuse me, genetic engineering might be another way to genetically modify plant varieties so that they can grow in more drought-tolerant locations. Now, of course, that always has the potential for negative impacts on other components of an ecosystem. So I need to put that rider in. Energy production, photovoltaic cells, solar energy, wind energy, all might reduce the consumption of fuel wood and so slow down, stop the deforestation, which is actually causing desertification. So there are many other features to this, but I want you to understand that it's just really unique because it's framing the project in an entirely different way in terms of responses, and it's framing international partnerships in a very different way. So hopefully you're getting a sense that the way that we approach response to systemic global changes, which are climate change and ozone depletion, are very different from the ways that we approach responses to cumulative global climate change. Let's take that back. Cumulative global changes like desertification and deforestation. And of course, the other thing it does is it promotes sustainable development. So we need to talk about this a little bit because, of course, sustainable development as a goal has been around since the late 1980s, if you remember that. But this is very much about long-term social sustainability. In terms of not just quality of life, but also, economic security and political stability, which is about social equity. Of course, it's about the environment and maintaining environmental systems, but it's also about the need to keep producing. I'm going with the economic part here. And it's not just necessarily producing for oneself, but also finding ways to produce for others. Maybe it's in an urban area, or maybe even participate in the global marketplace, which is a very big step. But absolutely at a local and a regional scale, it's promoting sustainable development. Because without that long-term thinking, we're not going to see any great change in how the land is being used. Now, a couple of updates since 1996. The United Nations has done a couple of things. Number one, 2010 to 2020. The United Nations identified that decade as the decade for deserts and the fight against desertification. And of course, its goal was to highlight the impacts and potential negative global impacts of desertification, but also to identify the driving forces, largely non-proximate, and actually do something about it. So we're just ending up that decade, so I imagine that we'll be expecting another United Nations update to the plan. Technology has changed a lot in 10 years. We could just talk about, computers and satellite imagery and remote sensing as ways to identify problems. That's changed dramatically in the last 10 years. So that will be a significant change. And overall, the goal of the decade was to raise awareness and action to promote protection and management of the world's drylands, which are home to a third of the world's population and, of course, face serious economic and environmental threats. And, of course, this extends beyond the local and even regional problems. We can tie this into global problems, systemic problems like global climate change, right? We get more deserts, we get more barren land. Of course, that changes the albedo. It changes the distribution of water, changes the hydrologic cycle, which would change productivity of land based on precipitation changes. I mean, of course, everything is interconnected. So we want to kind of finish up this course recognizing that we have all of these different global problems, but they're all interconnected. And that's one way we need to approach, basically all environmental problems. Now, the other thing is that just like the Kyoto Agreement, they have annual Conference of the Parties. So if you remember when we talked about global climate change, we talked about the original Kyoto Agreement, and then we talked about some different Conference of the Party events. The most recent for global climate change that we talked about was the Paris Agreement. Well, in the same way, this desertification effort has required annual meetings. I'm only going to highlight this one and then just make a final statement about what's going on now. But a notable Conference of the Parties was in 2007 in Madrid. And what they did, if you recall, the original response was implemented in 1996. Well, basically what they did in 2007 was to adopt a 10-year plan to enhance the original convention. So they took what they started with and actually made some very positive changes to it. And that was to be implemented from 2008 to 2018. And part of that was to increase partnerships between kind of donor countries and needy countries, and as well as non-governmental organizations, because the partnerships, not just in terms of money, but in terms of technology and guidance, they were needed to reduce poverty and increase sustainability. So they wanted better structured, more formalized partnerships. And the overall objectives of this 10-year plan that just finished involved improving living conditions, because living in poverty meant that people were inherently unable to make changes to the way they interacted with their environment. Their goal was also to improve ecosystems. And of course, this was all organized according to one of those four regions that we talked about at the beginning. Generate global benefits was to help people understand that by making these changes, we could actually see benefits in terms of raising the average quality of life, decreasing the potential for impacts on global climate change. And finally, as I mentioned, increase partnerships. And now this might be national, where one organization within a country helps communities, or it might be international aid. Now, finally, what's going on now? Well, the United Nations has met again and come up with a modified framework. So the United Nations, that's Convention to Combat Desertification, UNCCD. In 2018, they created what's called a strategic framework. And this is basically their most comprehensive global commitment to desertification and addressing the problems. And they refer to that as land degradation neutrality. The idea that they want to find ways to stop the ongoing processes and try to reverse them. And there are a lot of things going on. Again, on Canvas, there is a link to two things. I think it says response, Africa, the Green Wall, and Ethiopia, the forest churches. Those are two examples that are being developed in response to the follow-up from Madrid, and they're even now working more in the strategic framework, is to find ways to achieve degradation neutrality, which means stop making it worse and try to create long-term scenarios to improve land quality. So as you'd see in those two examples, the Green Wall example is about an 8-minute video. The church forest in Ethiopia, that's a National Geographic picture story. And so it's imagery, very nice photos, with kind of a commentary on the process. And both are being very successful in basically converting degraded land into vegetated land, not suitable quite yet for cropland or grazing, but it's amazing how far those projects have come in such a short time. So here the goal is to not make it worse. So the specific goal, to restore the productivity of vast expanses of degraded land, improve the livelihoods of an estimated 1.3 billion people who are living in these regions, and reduce the impacts of drought on vulnerable populations. Because by restoring some of the degraded land, people will have a greater buffer against drought if it should occur in the future.